Dr. Goodacre, Francis Hill Fox Professor of Religious Studies at Duke University. Thank you so much for once again allowing me to interview you and explore these ideas. So we're going to get into, I figure, why not talk about a few other scholars' work and what you think. I'm more like interested in what you think, and eventually I'll probably interview them and say, what do you think about his work and things like that? Because too often, your expertise in the Synoptics, let's say, and of course the New Testament, might be focused on the Gospels. Whereas someone might go, I'm a Pauline guy. And the other guy goes, oh, Revelation. And the inner dialogue that happens among scholars, I don't see enough on YouTube. It might happen in the personal at lunch. It might happen at the college, but the world isn't seeing it. So,
absolutely.
Dr. Jason Staples just wrote this. You love how I open that because it's like, he's a pit bull. I've heard from quite a few of his colleagues. He's the guy that like you don't want to debate, right? Like he's an intense. He's very passionate. That's why I can't wait to interview him on this topic. But Romans 11:25. It's this, right? I had Adi Ophir, Professors Adi Ophir and Ishai Rosenzweig on Goy. They came on to talk about these Gentiles. And they said, Paul's like a rabbi. He's hijacking Old Testament passages and just applying them there. He doesn't mean that these guys are literally anything. And I don't want to put words in Professor Staples' mouth either, because he's saying Paul's trying to double fulfill here. The nations as well as the lost tribes. By resurrecting them through the ethne, the nations, these are, because they were lost into the nations, among the nations, they're not ethnic Israelites, but he's resurrecting them, which is why Paul might say in Galatians like stuff like, well, in Christ, you are a seed of Abraham. You're now Abraham's children. I know that was a long little thing to get everyone who's watching aware, but how do you view, what are your thoughts of that? Do you take the position of like other scholars like James Tabor and others who say the Jews constitute Israel in the first century, and there isn't this like distinction, so to speak, in the New Testament? And how does that all Israel be saved? Is this just a stumbling block, this Gentile thing? Is this, I'm causing jealousy to Israel? Let's focus on these other guys. The nations will come in the last days, as Paula Fredrickson always talks about in her books, and then God will save all Israel. How do you interpret that passage and maybe like take us into the context?
It's one of those. So it's one of those really great text for debate, right? And sometimes biblical scholars have got a really bad reputation for just pulling out like kind of and looking at nitty-gritty little kind of verses, instead of looking at the bigger picture. But this is one of those where, because Paul says all Israel will be saved, you really want to know, well, what does he mean by all Israel, for starters?
Right.
And what does he mean by will be saved? Does it mean that they're all going to suddenly bow the knee and confess that Jesus is Lord? Or is there some other route? That's the question. And it's a really, really difficult one to tease out, because when Paul in Philippians 2 talks about the future, he says, at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue confess, right? So he seems to think there will come a time when everybody will confess the name of Jesus. Now, how do you marry that up with all Israel will be saved? That's the sort of big question. And then on the other side, there's also the question of, in 1 Thessalonians 2, he seems to talk about the wrath of God having fallen upon Jews or Judeans, and presumably he means there Jews or Judeans who have not confessed Jesus. So how do we square all those things? Sometimes when we talk about contradictions in the New Testament, we're looking at a contradiction between Matthew and Mark, and between Mark and Luke. This is Paul and the same person saying different things. And one of the things about, there was a great article written by a scholar called C.H. Dodd some years ago called The Mind of St. Paul. They always said saint in those days. The Mind of St. Paul. And he just says, Paul changed his mind as he went through. He matured, he said, in his thinking. And you can watch Paul changing in dialogue with others. So that's all a roundabout way of saying Romans 11:25 is quite difficult to interpret, given that Paul seems to say a range of related and different things in other contexts.
Right. That's a great point, actually.
I mean, so I think it's, I think if there's one thing that it's clear, it's that our questions are different from Paul's questions. I mean, the reason why this becomes so important to us is because we are anxious about the blood-stained 20th century anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, appalling acts of anti-Judaism. And because some of that happened because of a legacy within Christianity, we actually want to go back to the text and say, can we read these texts in other ways? Mm-hmm. And one thing that I think has come out of that, and lots of good things have come out of that, we are changing the way that we read the New Testament as a result of the post-Holocaust world that we live in. But one thing I think has really helped is you go back and look at how you translate some of this stuff. And I'll give one example of something that I think has really helped. John's Gospel. You constantly have, apparently, Jesus saying things about Jews, saying really negative things about Jews, and that's the way that it's always translated. And this scholar, Malcolm Lowe, comes out and he says, why do we keep translating this word Jews? The word in Greek is Judaioi, which you could just as well translate as Judeans. Now, does that help us in any way? Well, actually, I think it does, because several times what you actually see in John's Gospel is that Judeans are being contrasted with Galileans and Samaritans, right? So there is a geographical element to that. Now, you've still got John saying mean stuff about Judeans, so It doesn't help in that sense. But what it does help with is it helps you contextualize what's going on there and helps you to realize that the things that were being addressed in John's Gospel are not the same as our issues. You are not talking about all Jewish people everywhere when you're reading John's Gospel. You're talking about this specific group of Judeans in this specific place. And it's fascinating to sort of work through some of this stuff in John, because there are several places, if you look especially at John chapter 7, it actually doesn't make any sense, I don't think, to translate the word Judeo there as Jews. Much more sensible to translate it as Judeans, because he's specifically talking about going to Judea. Wow. And about Galilee, right? So, incidentally, that's a passage about Jesus' brothers as well, that mentioned there in John chapter 7. And so there you have a very interesting question about how does Jesus' family factor into this whole question of who's Judean and who isn't, in the first century.
Interesting, because I was reading his recent book, The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism. That is one of the starting points he tries to tackle is how do you understand, is it Jews, is it Judeans? And of course, there was a scholar who had a lot of anti-Semitic tendencies, Dr. Kuhn, who came out of this and of course was in Nazi Germany. I mean, he would wear his outfit to lectures. So you're right, there's a big deal there. I guess like one of the things, maybe probing into like Romans 9 to 11 to get your take on, Paul seems to reference places like Hosea. There is this context in the Jewish mind, if you will, or people that were practicing Judaism. They believe that there's a promise of the regathering. My question, and this is why I love listening to other scholarship on this. Like Collins has a different position. Collins thinks that the reconstituted Israel are the Judeans or Jews, and there's Jews among the diaspora. So technically, when James writes to the 12 tribes scattered abroad, who's he talking to? Two separate groups, Northern lost Israelites and Jews, or is he writing to a reconstituted Israel in Christ, as Staples will interpret it? What's going on? Or are we to suppose the most least likely is that, well, we have the two southern tribes, as Josephus says, in Rome, and there's really 10 northern tribes somewhere in Rome here that he's writing to, or how's he getting a letter to them when we know there's good reason to say the lost tribes are legend? Even Dr. Staples agrees. So my question, full circle, how do you take that? Like, there's a good point. Paul's quoting these lost Israelite references. But how do we understand that in the Romans 11? Like, what do you conclude makes the most sense to you?
I think the problem about talking about lost tribes and all the rest of it is Paul hadn't actually gone out on excursions interviewing people to find out if they knew anything about their genealogy, right? To find out, could this person be descended from Reuben, and is this person descended from Simeon? I mean, nobody was doing that. So talking about the 12 tribes is always going to be a construct. It's always going to be something that you are doing because you have read the Old Testament, because you've read the Hebrew Bible. And that means that anybody who's appealing to that is not appealing to something. I mean, whatever the origins of these people are, the concept is coming directly from them hearing these things read and discussing them with their fellow Jews. So that's always what the context of the thing is going to be.
It's a complicated one. It's super complicated, and I commend him for trying to figure out how, because Paul would obviously be trying to fulfill. He's in the end.
That's right.
He's it's about to happen.
That's right.
So I really enjoy his way of saying, well, maybe, just maybe. He realizes and recognizes these 10 tribes aren't necessarily present, or there's the other view of saying Jews now reconstitute Israel, and therefore scattered Jews. You can't really prove necessarily what your genealogy is technically, but then there's the idea they're out there somewhere, and it's this mythos that's being wrapped up at the end. And I think Acts tries to do that. Maybe I can probe on there.
One thing that is worth saying on Paul is that he definitely thinks that he's descended from Benjamin. I mean, he specifically talks about being from the tribe of Benjamin. So whether that is real or not. I mean, with genealogy, people today that do their genealogy, they discover all sorts of funky things they didn't realize. Like, what? I've suddenly found out I'm Greek. Yeah, exactly. There's all this sort of stuff. So who knows how Paul knew that? Was it just passed down from generation after generation? Presumably so. Could it have been several hundred years before Paul, one of his ancestors, just makes it up? We just don't know. But the fact is, he believes that, and he thinks that he is rooted in the tribe of Benjamin. So it's a reality to him, because he has that as a point he boasts about in Philippians 3. He actually says, from the tribe of Benjamin. That is something that I know what kind of ancestry I've got. So we know the issue is important to him, but it's difficult to get much beyond that to how he thinks about other people from other tribes.
The complexity in this question, I guess, and I love this, the way you're describing this is so fascinating. It's a fresh look in a way I've not really tried looking at this. The complexity of the nations, and I brought this up in the previous video we were recording already, is there's this idea that Israel will be scattered among the nations, depending on which book you read too, because they're not all the same. Sometimes it seems like they're no more, they're lost, but there's a promise they'll come back. Is this Ezekiel bone prophecy saying they're going to come back from the dead somehow because they're no longer? Or did they go out in the nations and then, as Tobit says, they go further behind mountains across the river and they only intermarry with each other? There's so many different amazing literature that gives you this lost tribe stuff. But there are groups, like I mentioned, that seem very dangerous in their thinking, that say, well, the only purpose, Paul says, I'm in chains for the hope of Israel. When they see those words, they get this the only point is literal Israelites, right? So then they get stuck in this and they don't look at academia. And it's hold on, I thought there were prophecies, as Paula Fredrickson brings out in her book, Paul the Pagan's Apostle, not only to Israel. She makes this really interesting pass too. She says Paul's opponents might think they're gathering the lost tribes. They're trying to circumcise. They're trying to make them Israelites. Right. Why is Paul not doing that? So this is a great question. But the question I have is, it's not just Israelites among the nations. The nations, it seems there's a prophetic bringing in it at some point. Could you comment on that? And then I got one more on the Gospels I'd love to delve into.
I don't really know what to say about that.
It's complex. That's the problem, because
I mean let me come at that across another angle. One of the most fascinating things about Paul is, why did he not go east?
Great question, Josephus.
Why did he not go east? Because when he describes his mission in Romans 15, he says, I've preached fully in a circle all the way from Jerusalem as far as Illyricum, right? And which is basically a western pass. I mean, he starts there and he just goes west. Why did it? I mean, there are plenty already. You know, when you read the Acts of Thomas from the 3rd century, you have this story of Thomas going to India. You know, I mean, so why did Paul never think that he? I mean, and for that matter, why didn't he go to Africa? Why didn't he go to? Because we know. I mean, one of the great mysteries about early Christian, missions
expansion,
is that Africa is evangelized, as it were, quite early on. We don't know where, by whom. It's one of the reasons why, you occasionally get these books which will do this thing where they'll go, Paul, the founder of Christianity, Paul, the first Christian, and all of that. Now, obviously, Paul is an absolutely essential, important person in the story, but one of the reasons why I think we have to avoid this idea that Paul somehow changes everything is that he doesn't go east and he doesn't go to Africa. So, and even in the areas where he does go, quite often he is going to places that have already been reached by somebody else. So when he writes the epistle to the Romans, he's not yet been to Rome, but there are clearly Christ followers there in Rome already. That's explicit. So we should probably avoid the idea of Paul as this kind of super Christian evangelist missionary who just transforms early Christianity. The reason why there's basically, I think there's 2 reasons why we tend to think like that. One is we've got his letters. He wrote letters. As far as we know, Apollos, for example, didn't write letters. And if he did write them, they've all lost. He probably didn't keep copies of them. I think Paul kept copies of his own letters, right? That's why we've got them. But second reason is Luke really, really liked Paul and decided to make him the hero of Acts of the Apostles. So we end up with this story in Acts of the Apostles. First half is all the others, second half is Paul. And so we kind of think in our mind, oh, well, Paul must be the guy then. He must be the man. And it's funny, a lot of the scholars who do this, Paul was the founder of Christianity thing, will be saying, we can't trust Acts of the Apostles. And yet they are so seduced by the Acts of the Apostles' vision of Paul as the number one guy that they sort of treat things that way. So
it's kind of hypocritical, yeah.
Well, I just don't think they've noticed it. The thing is with I was talking to a brilliant scholar just the other day on my podcast called Robin Walsh, and Professor Walsh said, do you know what she said? My best ideas often come when I say I am confused. When I look at the thing and I say I am confused. And for me with Paul, I was saying one day, I was teaching it, I was teaching Paul, and we asked this question, was Paul the founder of Christianity? It's a great undergraduate question to ask. Was he the founder of Christianity? Because you can go, well, on the one hand, but on the other hand, which is basically every undergraduate essay, compare, contrast, right? But as I was looking at that, I was thinking, well, if we do want to use that term, the founder of Christianity or something like that, then there's a whole bunch of things that we just can't explain, And I actually think that then I start thinking, but then why do we think that? And I think it's because, in spite of everything that critical scholars will say about Acts of the Apostles, deep down they're actually quite influenced by the fact that Luke thinks that Paul was so important.
Wow. We touched on this. This is the final thing. Mm-hmm. We touched on this, and I think it's good. Their social identity, for sure. Look at your cat. It's okay. Don't worry. Trust me, the kitty's not going to hurt anything. We look at social identity all the time, and one of the things I've brought up to you is like how Mark, you say he's Gentile leaning. Mm-hmm. Paul kind of backs it up a little, it sounds like, but then ends it with, let's go. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. For example, Mark is all these Gentiles are popping up. Then mm-hmm. Matthew's very legalistic sounding, like mm-hmm. You workers of lawlessness. Mm-hmm. Like, whoa, what in the world is going on here? And Gentiles do seem to be the picture, you know what mm-hmm. I mean? But the question I have is, I came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, right? When a fundamentalist sees this, and I'm not talking about a fundamentalist that's going to a Christian church who listens to a pastor who's going to reconcile this. I'm talking about someone who sees this and then they literalize that and go, mm-hmm. I came only for Israelites. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is how they interpret this. Mm-hmm. And then Luke comes on the scene. Oh, he doesn't only say, I came, or he says, rather go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, Matthew 10:6. He says, don't go to Gentiles, don't even enter the city of Samaritans.
Right.
Then in Luke and John, Jesus himself is doing the very thing Matthew says, do not do.
Right, yeah.
Something's going on with conflict, and this brings up the Judean Galilean issue. I think there might be regions, also potentially different groups, like the Samaritans were definitely not frowned. They're not like, Josephus isn't a fan of them. Can you touch on that social identity? What you think Luke's doing, what Matthew's doing versus Mark, and then what Luke's doing to correct that?
A friend of mine, James Barker, Professor James Barker, he thinks that John's story of the Samaritan woman is actually a reaction to the Matthew 10 thing of saying, go nowhere among the Samaritans. You know, so we're actually going to put Jesus in the Samaria. We're going to have him amongst the Samaritans, because it's such a blatant contradiction. So we definitely have that in the picture. And I mean, Luke also has this amazing story at the end of chapter 9 where a Samaritan village rejects Jesus. And James and John say, shall we call down fire from heaven on them? And Jesus, says, no, of course, we're not going to do that. That Michael Golder thinks, one of my academic heroes, Michael Golder thinks that Luke saw the story in Matthew 10 where Jesus says, go nowhere among the Samaritans. And then Luke thinks, well, there must have been a reason for that. So he surmises that, he was rejected there, right? So he thinks that that's going on in the background there. But certainly Samaritans as a group are one of the most curious elements in this whole picture, because you have Galilee here, you've got Samaria here, and you've got Judea here. How do you tell a story about somebody who is from Nazareth, who lives in Capernaum, but keeps going to Judea, like in John's Gospel, for example, and not bring up Samaria? And all three of those Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John, deal with that in different ways. I mean, in John, he just seems to be walking right on through Samaria, right? That's just, chapter 4, whole chapter given up to that. Luke's Gospel, well, he gets rejected by these Samaritans, and that then sets you up ready for the parable of the Good Samaritan, which comes a chapter later, where so the reader that doesn't know anything, someone is reading Luke's Gospel in Corinth or hearing Luke's Gospel in Corinth, they don't know anything about Samaritans unless they've never heard of them. So what Luke does is he sets up in chapter 9 already that you've got these negative Samaritans, so that the reader's thinking, oh, these Samaritans, these sound horrible. They want to murder. Actually, let me say that's not true. Sorry, not they want to murder. It's James and John who wants to murder them, but they're rejecting. So you're set up for them being hostile, ready for when Jesus says, but there was this good Samaritan, right? So for people that don't know the background, Luke as a storyteller has done quite a clever thing in setting that up. And then again in Luke 17, you get Samaritans again, because basically Jesus heals 10 lepers. And one of them comes back, and that one is a Samaritan. So he kind of closes that whole loop then by the end. So by the end, the story begins with them rejecting Jesus. You then hear about this anomaly of the Good Samaritan, and then you get this thankful leper who is commended warmly by Jesus in Luke 17. So these are, you can actually almost hear the early Christians saying, what actually ever happened with the Samaritans and Jesus? I mean, he's from Galilee and he spends all this time in Judea. I mean, did he go? I mean, especially if they haven't got many traditions around, if they haven't heard much about the Samaritans. So that's what sort of, they're all kind of reacting to this. And of course, in Mark's Gospel, you'd just assume that Galilee is right next to Judea, right? And, if you're reading Mark's Gospel, he's in Galilee all the way through till chapter 10, and then he basically sets off for Jerusalem. And you'd just assume, if you didn't know, that it's just right there. Well, not, there's still a road there, but there's he doesn't have to go through any other territory on the way.
I think this is fascinating too. One of the big, I guess, things is number one, this could potentially give reason to say Luke knew Matthew, which a lot of scholars act like that's not the case in light of this social identity conflict.
Right.
But also, what makes me wonder, there's two things. The Samaritans, I wonder if the prodigal son parable is trying to mend a conflict, because Josephus talks about this issue between Samaritans and Jews. But there was also this dividing wall we see in the 2nd century for sure, as Adio, Fear, and Ishai Rosensweig talk about Jew and then everyone else. So is this dividing wall a Samaritan Jew thing, or is this Jews and everyone else type thing? And it makes you wonder. But I guess the only last thing I'd say is John, when he says, I have sheep not of this fold, potentially talking about Samaritans instead? Because he's saying in Matthew, only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
Right.
Scratch Gentiles, scratch Samaritans. They're not lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then John's like, I have sheep that are not of this fold. Is he talking about Samaritans potentially being this? Because I think people differed on their view of Samaritans. It wasn't the majority of people thought they were, they're intruders that were supplanted by Assyria, blah, blah, blah. And then they have this horrible history put on them. But I wonder, what do you think?
Yeah, I think John is definitely open to the idea of I mean, clearly, because of chapter 4, he actually turns the Samaritan woman in chapter 4, the woman from the well, into one of the first Christian missionaries. Because what does she do at the end of that story? She goes and tells other Samaritans that she's found the Messiah. So one of the earliest evangelists, if you want to use the evangelist in that sense, one of the earliest evangelists, one of the earliest Christian missionaries in John's Gospel is a Samaritan woman. Now that has to be intentional. That has to be, he is clearly making a strong point here. Yeah. And incidentally, it's one of the great things about John's Gospel, because we also have Mary Magdalene right at the end of the Gospel in chapter 20 being the first person to proclaim Jesus' resurrection. She's the one who goes and says, I have seen the Lord, right? So this is why John's Gospel is often treated with such excitement by my grandfather, go back a few years, my grandfather, right back in the 1930s, was one of the first people in the UK to campaign for the ordination of women in the Church of England. And he spent much of his career just pushing away at this thing. And one of the things that I learned through talking to him is just how important gospel stories like that were to women who were basically not allowed to be ordained, who were barred from being ministers in the Church of England. To notice that you have people like the Samaritan woman in John 4 and Mary Magdalene in John 20 going out and preaching, and basically, in the case of Mary Magdalene, would anybody have known about it if she hadn't? There was this kind of talk. So it became hugely important in that movement, and that I just share that from the UK because that's where I'm from. But I know that that's been the case for for people all over the world. I'm just reading at the moment a book by Jamie Clark Souls, Women in the Bible. Great book, strongly recommend it. In fact, I've got her coming on my podcast soon. I've got an interview with her. But one of the things she does in that book is she integrates the discussion of women in the Bible with the way that women have sometimes been treated in our society. She talks about the groups that she, Jamie Clark Souls, speaks to, and different groups of clergy and so on. And what was interesting to me as someone that teaches in a secular religious studies department was seeing how those stories can actually be really, really important to not just women, but to people who want to understand these stories, like the Samaritan woman, like Mary Magdalene at the resurrection, or for that matter, throw in Mary and Martha from John 11 and 12, looking at how those stories are still used in communities and discussed in communities so that people can then work out their reaction to these texts. Sometimes I treat the biblical text like it's this ancient artifact because that's the way that I do things in a religious studies department. That's how we think about things. You have appropriate critical distance, and I look at this in the same way that I would be looking at Homer or Virgil or anything else like that. But every now and then it's useful for people like me to be reminded that these texts still mean things to many people and they're inspirational to many people. And so sometimes just getting a sense of that as well, I think can be quite exciting, even if it's something that is not part of my own kind of job.
And I think that's amazing because you're talking about the marginalized. It's not, women are really marginalized in those times. And the fact that this movement put them up in a way is really powerful.
There's an interesting side issue there, though, that, and this comes over, there's an interesting side issue there, though, as well, which is that sometimes it's very easy for us to say, well, Jesus was so great to women.
Right.
And lots of other Jews in the time, they were horrible with women. And then you realize, hold on a minute, what have I just done? I've just basically said Jesus was great because his fellow Jews were so awful. And basically a lot of Christian scholarship has done this. It has basically tried to make the backdrop of the Judaism of Jesus' day kind of negative in order that Jesus can shine out. And people do it with Paul as well. People say, oh, look at all these negative things Paul says about women. And then a lot of people say, oh yeah, but if you saw what some of the other Jews said about women, they're way worse, right?
Right.
And we just got to avoid that really naive and anti-Jewish way of looking at these texts, where you try and make the Christian characters the heroes and the Jewish characters the villains. And that has come, and that's not just in churches and so on, that's in scholarship too.